They were the most feared warriors in the world, raiders who made kings tremble and oceans run red. But in the year 1000 AD, the Vikings sailed west, and met a people who sent them running in absolute terror. This is the battle history forgot, until now. The world before the collision. In the age when the world was still vast and largely unknown, two warrior civilizations existed on opposite ends of the earth, separated by thousands of miles of frozen ocean, yet destined to collide in one of history's most forgotten and astonishing encounters. In the cold fjords of Scandinavia, the Norse people, whom the world would come to fear as Vikings, had built a civilization of iron, fire, and fury. These were not merely raiders. They were explorers, traders, shipbuilders, and storytellers. Their longships, carved from oak and sealed with pine tar, could cut through the most savage Atlantic storms. Their warriors had raided the monasteries of England, the coasts of France, and the markets of Constantinople. No people on earth were more feared on the open sea. Yet for all their conquests, the Norse gazed westward with curiosity. Beyond Iceland, the frozen island they had colonized, beyond Greenland, a brutal, icy land settled by the legendary Eric the Red, sailors whispered of another land. A land of green forests, warm winds, and wild game. A land no European had ever mapped or named. On the other side of that ocean, in the forests and coastlines of what we now call North America, lived people who had inhabited this land for over 12,000 years. Complex nations of hunters, fishermen, and warriors who knew every river, every wind, and every stone of their territory. They were not primitives. They were masters of their environment, fierce, intelligent, and deeply spiritual warriors who had never seen a metal blade, a sailing ship, or a man with pale skin and a red beard. These two worlds, each believing themselves to be at the center of the universe, were about to meet. And the meeting would be soaked in blood. Eric the Red and the Seeds of Exploration. The story begins with a man banished from Iceland for murder. Eric Thorvaldsson, known as Eric the Red for his flame-colored hair and violent temper, was exiled from Iceland around 982 AD after killing a man in a blood feud. Rather than accept his fate quietly, Eric did what only the most extraordinary Viking souls ever did. He sailed further west into the unknown. What he found was Greenland, a vast, harsh island of ice and stone. Eric was clever in his naming. He called it Greenland to attract settlers, believing a beautiful name would lure colonists. And it worked. He returned to Iceland, recruited hundreds of families, and sailed back to establish the first permanent Norse settlements in Greenland. But Greenland, for all its harsh beauty, was not a place of abundance. The Norse settlers needed timber, grain, and iron, resources that Greenland's frozen landscape could barely provide. And so, when a Norse sailor named Jarni Herjolfsson reported that he had been blown off course and spotted a strange forested coastline far to the west, the seeds of the greatest westward journey in history were planted. Eric the Red heard the story. And his son, a young, bold, deeply curious man named Leif Erikson, decided to go find that land himself. Leif Erikson reaches the New World. Around the year 1000 AD, Leif Erikson set sail from Greenland with 35 men aboard a single longship. He followed Bjarni's vague directions westward, and after days at sea, land appeared on the horizon. He reached first a land of flat stones and glacier. He named it Helgeland, Stone Slab Land, likely what we now call Baffin Island. Sailing south, he found a land of white beaches and thick forest, Markland, Forest Land, likely Labrador. And finally, he reached a place of grassy meadows, mild climate, salmon-filled rivers, and wild grapes growing on the vines. He named it Vinland, the land of wine. Leif and his crew wintered in Vinland, building longhouses and marveling at the richness of the land. They found no people, or perhaps the people found them first and chose to wait and watch. When spring came, Leif loaded his ship with timber and grapes and sailed back to Greenland with tales of paradise. But Leif himself never returned to Vinland. He had inherited the leadership of Greenland's Norse colonies from his father. Instead, others would follow his path, and they would not find paradise. They would find war. Thorvald Eriksson, the first blood. It was Leif's brother, Thorvald Eriksson, who first made contact, and first paid in blood. Thorvald arrived in Vinland around 1003 AD with a crew of 30 men, using his brother's abandoned camp as a base. For a full year, they explored the coastlines and forests without encountering any native people. The land was impossibly rich, teeming with fish, deer, and timber. Thorvald grew bold. Then one afternoon, exploring a river delta, his crew discovered something unexpected beneath an overturned wooden boat: 3 sleeping men. Before anyone could think clearly, the Vikings seized them. They were Skraelings, the Norse name for the native peoples of North America, a word meaning roughly wretches or foreigners. Of the 3 men they seized, 2 managed to escape and flee into the forest. The third was killed. It was the first act of violence between Europeans and the people of the Americas. And its consequences came swiftly. Hours later, a fleet of canoes emerged from the tree line, dozens of them, filled with warriors. The Skraelings launched a devastating volley of arrows. The Norse scrambled to their ships, raising their shields in the classic Viking shield wall defensive formation. Most of the arrows clattered harmlessly against iron and oak. But one arrow found a gap. It struck Thorvald Eriksson beneath his arm, a mortal wound. As his men gathered around him, Thorvald reportedly spoke his final words with dark Viking humor: "I have gotten a wound that will be the death of me. But I urge you to make ready for your journey home as quickly as possible. I have been given a good country to settle in, it is just that my time is so short." He died there on the shore of Vinland. His men buried him on a headland between 2 crosses, as he had requested, in the soil of a land that had not welcomed him. Then they sailed back to Greenland, carrying with them the first evidence of what this new world truly was: not an empty paradise, but a land already owned, already defended, and already deadly. Thorfinn Karlsefni, the Great Attempt. Word reached Greenland of Vinland's riches, and also of its dangers. But the Norse were not a people easily frightened. In 1010 AD, a wealthy merchant explorer named Thorfinn Karlsefni mounted the most ambitious Viking expedition to the New World yet attempted. He sailed with 3 ships, between 160 and 250 men and women, livestock including cattle and a bull, supplies for years, and a clear intention: to build a permanent colony in Vinland. His wife, Gudrid Thorbjarnadottir, was among the settlers, one of the most remarkable women in Norse history, who would eventually travel from Greenland to Rome and back in her lifetime. They established a settlement called Hop, meaning tidal lake or hope, somewhere along the northeastern coast of North America. Archaeological evidence at Lance Auxiliary Meadows in Newfoundland confirms Norse presence in North America, though the exact location of Hop is still debated by historians. For the first few weeks, everything seemed almost peaceful. First contact, canoes on the horizon. One morning, the lookout spotted movement on the water. Then more movement. Then the full terrifying reality: a massive fleet of hide-covered canoes, paddled by hundreds of Skraeling warriors, emerging silently from the river mouths and inlets. The Norse grabbed their weapons and braced for battle. But the Skraelings did not attack, not yet. They paddled in a slow circle around the Norse settlement, studying every detail. Then, as quietly as they had appeared, they vanished back into the forest. A week later, they returned. This time, they came ashore. What followed was something neither civilization had ever experienced: first contact trade. The Skraelings, cautious and curious, held up bundles of furs, beaver pelts, fox skins, ermine. The Norse, following Karlsefni's strict instructions, held up red cloth. Trade began. The Skraelings had never seen woven cloth before. They were fascinated. They wanted it desperately, trading large, valuable fur bundles for small strips of red fabric. Karlsefni, seeing their obsession with the cloth, began cutting the strips smaller and smaller, getting more and more furs for less and less cloth. By Norse standards, it was clever commerce. By Skraeling standards, it would soon become an insult. Then Karlsefni made a decision that historians argue over to this day: he refused to trade iron weapons to the Skraelings, even when they clearly desired them. He sensed, correctly, that arming these warriors would be catastrophic. But his refusal was also noticed. And resented. For a few weeks, the uneasy peace held. Gudrid gave birth to a son in Vinland, a boy named Snorri, who became the first European child born in the Americas. It seemed, for a brief moment, that Vinland might actually become the new Viking homeland. Then a bull escaped. The bull, the breaking point, and war. Karlsefni's livestock included a large, loud, terrifying bull, an animal the Skraelings had never seen or imagined. When the bull broke free from its pen and charged bellowing through the forest near the native encampment, the Skraeling warriors, who feared nothing in the forest they had hunted all their lives, were seized by absolute animal panic. They interpreted the bull as a monster, a demon, or a war signal. War parties mobilized instantly. Within hours, a massive fleet of canoes appeared, far larger than before. Hundreds of warriors. War paint. Weapons the Norse had never seen. The Skraelings wielded war slings, devices capable of hurling stones and other projectiles with tremendous force and accuracy. But what truly struck terror into the Vikings was what happened next. The saga describes it in chilling terms. They raised up on a pole a large round object, roughly the size of a sheep's belly, and it was dark blue in color. It flew through the air, and when it landed, it made a tremendous crashing sound. Historians believe this was likely a type of weighted projectile, perhaps a large inflated bladder filled with stones or sealed with tar, used as a shock weapon to terrify and disorient the enemy. Whether it was a primitive form of catapult ammunition or a large, dense war stone, the psychological effect was devastating. The Vikings broke. These men, the same warriors whose ancestors had raided half of Europe, turned and ran. The fierce, ironclad Norse warriors, veterans of countless battles, fled in terror from this strange flying weapon they had never imagined. Freydis Eriksdottir, the woman who stopped the retreat. In the chaos of the retreat, one figure refused to run. Freydis Eriksdottir, daughter of Eric the Red, half-sister of Leif, and one of the most ferocious personalities in Viking history, was heavily pregnant at the time of the battle. She could barely move quickly. She heard the screams of retreating Norse warriors, saw her own men fleeing past her in terror, and felt something inside her turn to ice-cold fury. She screamed at the retreating men, "Why do you flee from such pitiful wretches? You are brave men, act like it. If I had weapons, I would fight better than any of you." No one stopped. The retreat continued. Freydis was left nearly alone. She stumbled across the body of a fallen Norse warrior. She reached down and picked up his sword. Then, in one of the most extraordinary acts ever recorded in the Norse sagas, she pulled open her garment and slapped the flat of the blade against her bare chest, turning to face the advancing Skraeling warriors. The warriors stopped. What they saw before them defied everything in their world: a pregnant woman, sword in hand, bare-chested and roaring, standing her ground while armored men fled behind her. In many native warrior traditions, encountering something that defied the natural order, something deeply strange and spiritually powerful, was a sign to withdraw. Whether they believed her demented, supernatural, or simply the most dangerous creature they had ever faced, the Skraeling advance halted. Freydis stood alone on the shore of Vinland, sword in hand, the ocean at her back, and the forest full of warriors before her, and she did not flinch. The battle ended. The Skraelings withdrew. It was a victory of sorts. But it was also the beginning of the end. The abandonment of Vinland. In the days following the battle, Karlsefni held a long council with his leaders. The wounds were counted, several Norse dead, many wounded. The Skraeling warriors were more numerous than anyone had imagined, and they knew the land with an intimacy the Norse could never match. The iron weapons of the Vikings gave them an advantage in direct combat, but the Skraelings did not fight in the open. They attacked from forests. They moved through rivers like shadows. They knew every trail, every valley, every approach. And there were thousands of them. The Norse were perhaps 200 people, men, women, and children, at the furthest edge of the known world, weeks from Greenland by sea, with no possibility of reinforcement. The saga records the final assessment with devastating simplicity. They realized that even though this was good land, their lives here would always be dominated by battle and fear. Karlsefni gave the order. They would leave Vinland. They loaded the ships with everything salvageable, timber, furs, whatever remained of their supplies, and sailed northeast back toward Greenland. Snorri, the first European child of the Americas, made the voyage as a toddler, not yet understanding the significance of the world he was leaving behind. Behind them, on the shores of Vinland, the Skraeling peoples reclaimed their forests. The longhouses the Norse had built slowly rotted. The names the Vikings had given to rivers and capes were forgotten. The land went back to silence. The legacy: what history forgot and archaeology found. For centuries, the story of Vinland was dismissed as legend, a colorful tale from the Norse sagas, too fantastical to be historical fact. Columbus was celebrated as the discoverer of America. The Vikings were mentioned in footnotes, if at all. Then, in 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife and Stein Ingstad made a discovery that changed everything. At a remote site in northern Newfoundland called Lance Auxiliary Meadows, they found the unmistakable remains of Viking longhouses, turf-built Norse structures over 1,000 years old. Iron boat rivets. A bronze cloak pin of Norse design. The physical proof of everything the sagas had described. The Vikings had been there. They had been first. The site, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is the only confirmed Norse settlement in North America, a ghostly monument to the most audacious voyage in the pre-Columbian world, and to the battle that ended it. But the Skraeling peoples, the Native Americans and Inuit who had defended their land against these strange iron-carrying invaders, kept their own memories. In Inuit oral tradition passed down through centuries, there are stories of strange pale men who came from the sea, who carried bright metal, and who eventually disappeared. Stories of encounters, of battles, of things that could not be explained. The Norse called the encounter a defeat. The native peoples simply called it, defending home. And in the end, the warriors of Vinland won. Not through technology. Not through numbers. But through something the Vikings, conquerors of half the known world, had never faced before, a people who would never, under any circumstances, surrender their land. The world they left behind. After leaving Vinland, Thorfinn Karlsefni and Gudrid sailed to Norway, then eventually settled in Iceland. Gudrid later made a pilgrimage to Rome, traveling further across the world than almost any woman of her era. Their son Snorri, born in the Americas, grew up in Iceland and had descendants who became bishops. Freydis Eriksdottir returned to Greenland, where her reputation for savagery only grew. The sagas tell darker stories of her later years, describing a ruthless woman who would destroy even her own allies to secure power. Whether hero or villain, she remains one of the most vivid personalities of the Viking Age. The Norse Greenland colony survived another 400 years before finally disappearing around 1400 AD, victims of climate change, the Black Death's disruption of trade routes, and possibly renewed conflict with the Inuit people they called Skrælings. When Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, he believed he had found a new world. He had not. He had found a world that the bravest, most fearless seafarers of the medieval age had already reached, and from which they had been driven away by people who had been defending their homes since time began. The battle that made Vikings terrified was not just a military defeat. It was a collision between two civilizations at the edge of the known world, a moment when the most feared warriors on earth looked into the eyes of men and women who feared nothing, and understood, for the first time, what it felt like to be the ones who did not belong. The shores of Vinland remember. Even now, 1,000 years later, the ocean holds the memory of longships and war canoes, of red cloth and iron swords, of a bull that ran loose and changed history, and of a woman who stood alone on a beach and refused to be afraid of anything.